So, with the release and immense popularity of Dispatch and all of its various choices that you can make throughout the story, a conversation that I've seen happen over and over before has started making the rounds again. And that's, of course, the fact that developers keep getting surprised when the vast majority of their players end up picking the good options over the evil or even just slightly meaner options in their games. Because, yeah, this is a fairly common trend at this point. I still recall that in Mass Effect, it was something like 95% of players would just play Paragon runs and not bother with Renegade. Most people ended up choosing to be good in Infamous, most people prefer the pacifist route in Undertale, and now most people generally like being nice guys in Dispatch. Now, it is still worth pointing out that we're talking very generally here. We're talking about trends with lots of people, not individuals. Maybe you personally thought that harvesting the little sisters in Bioshock was the correct thing to do, or you know someone who unironically aligns themselves with Renegade Shepard throughout all three Mass Effects on their first playthrough. But when we talk about large groups of people or the entire community for a given game, generally speaking, the vast majority tend to not want to be mean for no reason. Now again, this may still come off as a surprise for some people, as so many games are about casual violence and whatnot, but again, there is a difference between, say, when a shooter simply asks the player to kill thousands of people because it's a shooter and that's how you make progress, as opposed to when a game much more explicitly frames a moment as a moral choice. It's the difference between, say, hacking your way through splicers without a second thought in Bioshock compared to when you're actually presented with the little sister choice and an explicit good and evil option. So what creates this pattern so consistently? Why do people so often end up picking the good choices in all of these games? It'd be one thing for it to talk about a slight preference, like 60% or even 75%, but we're talking like 90% or higher often end up picking the good options in these kinds of games. And, well, to be frank, the answer to this is actually kind of simple. Believe it or not, most people tend to not want to be evil for no reason. Doubly so when they're invested in the characters in the game. Like, it's one thing when we're talking about a game like, say, Skyrim or Grand Theft Auto, where famously when people get bored, it's common for them to just go on mindless rampages and see how many random NPCs they can kill before getting taken down themselves, and that's because these games are full of countless nameless NPCs that the player has zero investment in. But when you talk about a game like Undertale, well, now suddenly we're talking about a game with extremely well thought out and lovable characters like Toriel and Papyrus and all of these friendly faces that you come to know and love over the course of the game. So it really should come as no surprise that when presented with the option to just mindlessly slaughter them, most people choose not to. But it goes beyond just not wanting to kill well-written characters. To get a little bit more philosophical, I think that it's fair to say that most people tend to think of themselves as a good person. Nobody sane, at least, wakes up in the morning simply saying, I'm going to be a mustache-twirling villain today, like a Saturday morning cartoon or something. Now sure, you might think that someone is blatantly evil, like say a good old-fashioned racist, a la Calvin Candy from Django Unchained, but while you or I would say that Calvin and his beliefs are obviously evil, the thing is that from his own perspective, he justifies his actions by holding various beliefs in things like the bullshit that is phrenology in order to explain why he should own slaves and be in the position that he's in. To him, he's not being racist. He's not, torturing these people with slavery. This is simply the natural order of things, and who is he to say otherwise? Wars are not fought between good and evil, they're fought between two groups of people who both find ways to justify themselves being the good guys in the situation, often for wildly different reasons. The point of this tangent is that even if someone is clearly going to do something that is obviously evil or harmful to someone else, they usually end up coming up with some kind of justification in order to justify their actions and still feel like they're being a good person or doing the right thing, or at the very least, that the ends will justify the means. And as such, I think that this is the main reason why such blatantly evil choices tend to be so unpopular in video games, because so many games just allow you to be an asshole for the sake of adding that choice to the game, but they don't actually follow through with giving the player any kind of proper justification or motivation to actually be an asshole. I mean, this is basic character writing 101, isn't it? Like, just because the player is in control of the character doesn't mean that you can just skimp out on giving them a motivation for their actions. If anything, you need to give the player more motivation than anything else, because that's how you get someone invested in a game. So, to drive the point home, let's take a look at some examples of how some games present their moral choices, and especially how they justify picking the more evil options, because that's really what it comes down to. It's not enough to just offer an evil choice, you need to tempt the player into picking it for some reason. Now, I still feel like the ultimate example of a poorly written evil choice is the choice to blow up Megaton in Fallout 3. I've already talked about this before, but it's just so overly cartoonishly evil. The setup is that the first town you go to in Fallout 3 is Megaton, and it's a simple introductory town with a bunch of nice people that help you get started on your journey. You can do some minor quests for the townsfolk, there's one person that basically gives you a survival guide quest line, and you can even find shelter in a house within the city. The only twist is that there is an armed, undetonated thermonuclear device just sitting in the middle of town, because of course a bunch of people would settle next to an undetonated nuke for some reason. Now, of course, you can help the town out immensely by disarming the nuke for them and finally give them some safety and peace to all of the kind people of this town. A simple, objectively good deed as long as you have some training and the relevant skills. Or, if you're just an asshole for some reason, there's a random guy in the bar who offers to pay you 1,000 caps to rig the bomb to explode. Just like, as a prank, bro, or something. Like, seriously, the only actual reason they give you for why they want to blow up Megaton and kill all of these innocent people is because a bunch of rich assholes don't like how the town obstructs the view from their hotel that they somehow have in this post-apocalyptic wasteland. Like, there is just no justifiable reason that the player could possibly have for wanting to kill those people. They do nothing but show themselves to be fairly nice and actively helpful to the player on multiple occasions. Ultimately, this is really just a case of the game adding an evil choice to try and make it seem like there's more variety in what choices you can make, so that they can be like, oh look, wow, you could blow up an entire city in this game, isn't that crazy? And just put that in the advertisements. But the reality is that it's not even that interesting of a choice. Like, all that really happens if you actually go through with detonating the city is that you just remove content from the game and delete a bunch of NPCs and lose access to a couple of stores in a player house, and that's kind of about it. Even the main NPC that gives you the survival guide questline kind of just magically survives as a ghoul so that you can continue the one big questline that you can get from Megaton. And like, the only direct reward you're given is 1,000 caps, which isn't even that much money. Like, you can get up to 500 caps for disarming the nuke, so even if you're basing your decisions entirely off greed and selfish desire, you really don't get that much out of nuking Megaton, and you arguably lose more since you lose access to the various stores and the convenient placement of the town and the player home they're in. So like, even if the choice being presented here was better written, to at least give you some reason to want to slaughter all these people like they were secretly a cannibal cult or something, I don't know. I don't see many people thinking that the rewards will justify doing a complete a genocide of every single living person in this city. Like, either they would have to make basically every single person in Megaton into, like, completely irredeemable asshole raiders or something, or they would have to offer the player, like, a laughable amount of money that you couldn't just get from a few quests and hours of exploring the wasteland. Also, and I know that this is a bit of a tangent, but I think that I could argue that this same reasoning of providing the player with very bad motivation or no motivation at all is also one of the reasons why the original ending of Fallout 3, where you sacrifice yourself, was so hated. Not to spoil too much, but basically the player is put into a scenario where someone has to go into a radiation-filled chamber to enter a code and save the day, and whoever does this will obviously receive a lethal dose of radiation and surely die. And this is actually a rare example where I feel like going for the more heroic, self-sacrificial choice is what is given such poor motivation in this game. Because obviously the heroic thing to do would be to sacrifice yourself and save everyone else, giving your life for the cause so nobody else has to die. But like, avoiding death is usually a pretty strong motivator for most people, and worse still, you're given multiple party members like a super mutant and a robot that are explicitly immune to radiation, who could easily perform this task without risking their lives, and thus making it so that nobody has to die, not even the person pushing the button. I mean, there are literally quests where sending radiation-immune companions into highly irradiated rooms is a major plot point. So like at that point, it stops being a heroic sacrifice. Bethesda clearly had this image in mind of the player making this big sacrifice at the end of the game, but they failed to actually give the player any reason to do so when there are so obviously much better alternatives to dying for no reason. So like, by the same measure that you cannot reasonably expect a player to just commit obviously evil acts with zero motivation or justification for their actions, you also shouldn't really expect the player to perform pointlessly sacrificial good acts and put themselves and their own well-being into harm's way for overly charitable actions for no reason. Like, it's one thing to donate some money to save some starving children, but I'm not about to throw away my entire life savings over it. But okay, let's shift to a better example of how I think moral choices could be constructed, and I think that a game worth talking about that I haven't mentioned before is Disco Elysium. Now, Disco Elysium is a lot, and there is no shortage of a wide variety of choices that the player encounters on their adventure to solve the game's various mysteries. In fact, I might do a whole video just on this game at some point, but I think a good microcosm to look at is how this game treats drug and alcohol use. The main character, who I will refer to as Raphael should the need arise, starts the game by waking up from a massive multi-day long booze and drug-filled bender that was so bad that not only did he actually not do the job that he was sent there to do, but he also ruined a bunch of people's days, caused a ton of property damage, and gave himself complete retrograde amnesia. As such, when he finally comes to and starts being controlled by the player, and especially now that his partner has arrived to help him solve the main case of the game, it makes sense that the player may come to the conclusion that it is a good idea to quit cold turkey and actually focus on trying to get the job done. But there is still no shortage of booze and drugs to be found in the game, and they actually give you stat bonuses for taking them. For example, drinking alcohol gives you a +1 bonus to all your physique-based skills, and smoking a cigarette helps you focus and gives you bonuses to your intellect-based skills. And there's a lot of really hard skill checks in this game. Hell, some checks you can only ever attempt once, and failing some of these checks can force you to resort to some pretty bad alternatives as your only way out, such as having to internalize critical race theory. So I feel like the game actually does a surprisingly good job of almost making you feel like an addict. It becomes really easy to justify to yourself that you just need to do one quick smoke to get through this conversation, or I'll just have one drink to dull this pain, and then I swear I'll quit. But of course, you can't know what kinds of checks that you're going to encounter in the future, and you might find yourself repeatedly having to make this justification over and over if you're not careful. Now, of course, there are still inherent downsides to taking these drugs, of course. Drinking booze damages your morale, smoking damages your health, etc., etc. Not to mention that money is incredibly tight in this game, so you'll have to keep buying and hunting down new drugs to keep it going, which means you might have cash for other useful items. But compared to the bonuses that you can get and the relative ease of healing yourself, these penalties can sometimes feel pretty minor in the moment. The real downside downside to taking drugs in this game is, of course, the fact that you will inevitably disappoint your partner Kim. And trust me, if you have played Disco Elysium, then you know that the feeling of disappointing Kim is tantamount to a war crime. He doesn't, like, punish you or anything, not directly at least, but between Kim being disappointed in you and the story context that you're playing as someone who just went on such a hard bender that they lost all of their memories, it's pretty clear that the best thing for Raph long term is for him to sober up. And this is what I think makes this such a good moral choice, in my opinion. You don't get any kind of explicit mechanical benefit or reward for keeping Raphael sober, just the satisfaction that you're finally starting to turn your life around and gain some of the approval of those around you. Meanwhile, the temptation to backslide into those addictions is always present, offering you meaningful short-term benefits and rewards in exchange for literally damaging your body and what few relationships you have left in this world. And when you reach those tough skill checks in this game, especially if you've had your electrochemistry skill constantly yelling at you in your ear, it can be hard to resist the temptation to take that get hit to make your way through it. For another poor example, let's take another look at BioShock. I know I've talked about this game before, but I feel like the little sister choice is not only a poorly designed moral choice on its own merits, but it's also made worse when you zoom out and look at it through the themes of the game. So, on the surface, this game just has a really simple binary choice given to you at certain points during the story. Throughout the story, you encounter various big daddies, which serve as boss fights because they are guarding little sisters, which are tasked with collecting the atom necessary to fuel all the magic plasmid powers that you get throughout the game. As such, when you kill a big daddy, you are presented with the choice to either kill the little sister that they were protecting, which will allow you to harvest as much atom as possible from them to become more powerful, or you can spare the little sister, which still grants you some atom, but you only get about half as much as normal, making you much weaker, and thus potentially making the challenges ahead that much harder. So, on the surface, this actually aligns with how I think a good moral choice should be presented. The clearly more evil option of killing these innocent little sisters is also the more rewarding option, giving the player a good temptation and justification for why they might want to go down the evil path. Meanwhile, sparing them saves their lives, which is obviously more ethical, but of course the player gets less material value out of the deal. But I feel like the game ruins this because once you save only 3 little sisters, they then reward you with a present that almost entirely makes up the difference in atom rewards, as if you had been harvesting them the entire time. If you do the math, you get something like 480 total atom from harvesting 3 little sisters, whereas you get 440 atom if you save the little sisters instead after you take into account the extra reward. But on top of that, you're also given other bonuses like first aid kits, Eve hypos, gene tonic power-ups, and on top of all of the other stuff, there's even a unique plasmid ability that you can only get by saving the little sisters. So when you put it all together, you actually get way more rewards for saving the little sisters over harvesting them. Yeah, it's delayed a little bit, and I can get behind the idea of giving the good choices more rewards but having them be delayed, but it's only delayed by 3 little sisters, and I feel like that's soon enough that a new player could start out by wanting to save them until it gets too hard for them to handle it, but since you get that extra reward so early in the game, they likely won't be feeling the pressure from being too weak all that much by the time they get the reward that pretty much makes up the difference and thus makes it so that they no longer feel weakened. So, at the very least, I just feel like the game doesn't make me feel the consequences of my actions for all that long before I'm inevitably rewarded for being a good boy and becoming nearly as strong as I would have been if I had taken the dark path instead. But I think it gets even worse when you look at it through the main themes of the game, which is something that Pat Stares At recently talked about in one of his streams, and honestly I'm kind of kicking myself for not thinking to bring it up the last time I talked about BioShock. In case you couldn't pick up on the oh so incredibly subtle themes of Bioshock, it is very much a critique of Randian objectivism. And I mean, Andrew Ryan, Ayn Rand, it's very subtle, I know. Basically, it's a fairly selfish philosophy that argues that one should always be acting in one's own rational self-interest. Basically, if you're not maximizing your own material gains with every choice, then they argue that you are acting irrationally. Factors like kindness, generosity, and empathy that you might use to argue against taking as much as possible for yourself at all times are deemed as irrational behaviors. Obviously, I'm simplifying things a bit, but that is one of the big general ideas of the philosophy that led to Rapture's downfall. They're against the idea of regulating what people are allowed to and not allowed to do, and that led to people being incredibly greedy and selfish, partaking in countless unethical scientific and economic practices in the pursuit of the maximum gain for themselves at all times. As such, you can see how this can be applied to the little sister choice. In my view, the choice being the only real choice that is actually presented to the player in the game really should have been a test of this philosophy being presented to the player, but it's kind of ruined by the fact that you're rewarded so much for taking the otherwise good and selfless option. Tenenbaum even tells you before you have a chance to make the first choice that you're reminded of this with a pop-up just to make sure you don't miss it, that she will quote-unquote make sure that it's worth your while for you to save the little sisters. So even if you're viewing this choice through the terribly broken philosophy that destroyed Rapture, you're basically presented with one option that does get you more Adam immediately, but another option that gets you almost as much Adam and a ton of other stuff on top of that. So like, of course, even the most greedy players are likely to go with the good option to save the little sisters, since you get pretty much as much stuff out of it as you do taking the evil option. In my view, I agree with Pat in saying that the evil choice of harvesting the little sisters should have rewarded the player with a laughably higher amount of Adam. Like, even if we still give out extra rewards for every 3 girls that you save, it shouldn't even come close to the amount of Adam that you can get for harvesting them. Or at the very least, maybe the extra Adam rewards should have been doled out a little bit more slowly over the course of the game. They could start out small and grow larger with every 3 girls that you save, so that the player is still operating at a much more significant deficit for much more of the game. That way, now the choice lines up more closely with a test of objectivism. Do you go for the raw power and sacrifice those innocent children to maximize your own gains in the short term, becoming that much more invested in plasmids and in turn a perfect embodiment of what destroyed Rapture? Or do you reject this power so that others may live, even if it makes you weaker for much more of the game? And by having a much more significant Adam deficit, it would make the game a lot harder for a lot longer on runs where you pick the good choices, which could help tempt players towards maybe considering the more selfish option and make the scenario a lot less one-sided and clear-cut. And if we ramp up the rewards for being good over time, then we can kind of eat our cake and have it too. Like, we can still make it so that being good eventually gets you nearly as much, if not more power than being selfish, but the player should have to work towards it for much longer, with it not being necessarily as obvious that you will be getting such a large reward by the end of the game, and by making the player go through a lot more difficult trials to earn it, compared to the easy route of just sacrificing everyone around you for personal gain, it makes it a lot less clear cut as to whether saving them is actually worth risking your life. Finally, I feel like I have to at least touch on Frostpunk and its sequel one more time, because the Frostpunk series has a really simple solution for getting players to pick evil options, and that solution is to quite simply not give the player any good options as an alternative. Okay, I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but basically the Frostpunk series is all about an incredibly dire situation. The world is frozen over and only getting colder, with no sign of it ever stopping. Not to mention that you're dealing with 19th century London London level technology and societal standards. Like, we're talking about a setting where the workday starts at, I think, 10 hours long and can be extended to 14 hours long, or even temporary 24-hour long shifts, depending on how far you want to go, with no way to actually shorten it. There are definitely some options that, on at least some level, feel less evil than others. Like, for example, like, the way that you usually pick the quote-unquote good options in this game is that you can just choose not to enact certain laws, like child labor, or to put sawdust in the food supply in order to get extra calories, things like that. Like, it's not about choosing a good alternative, it's about choosing to not do the bad thing. But of course, that always comes with the downside of not getting the extra benefits from those laws. Without child labor, you might not have enough workers to gather the materials needed to withstand the winter. Sure, putting sawdust in the food might get people sick, but not putting sawdust in the food might result in people starving. So it's a game all about picking your poison. It presents the player only with options to try and make the scenario slightly less worse than it already is, and it's up to them to decide what they're willing to sacrifice to keep the society alive. Not to mention that in the sequel, you don't have absolute authority over which laws get passed, so it adds another element of having to play politics to try and appease people in order to get them to vote for different laws, and that can result in you having to pass laws that you personally are morally against being in the city, but you have to do it in order to get those people to vote for, say, a different law that you really want enacted, adding even more depth to what you're willing to sacrifice for the sake of survival. So, in summary, if we look back at everything we've talked about so far today, as I said at the start, it's very important to give the player a good justification for doing whatever options you're presenting them with. It's not enough to simply add choices to the game for the sake of increasing the amount of player choice there is, if most of the options being presented are just complete non sequiturs that either don't make sense within the story being presented, or don't give the player any real motivation to pick them beyond just wanting to see different content, then it should come as no surprise when players don't choose to pick those options. After all, being evil should be a temptation. The classic dichotomy is that usually the more selfish and evil acts are the quick and easy path to material gain or power, whereas being good usually means you need to work harder in order to attain that same reward. After all, in many ways, it's easier, or at least quicker, to make a quick buck by mugging someone as opposed to getting a legit well-paying job. And like, you can still have consequences to your actions for being bad. If you start mugging people, then naturally you're putting yourself at risk of being arrested. I'm not saying that evil choices in games should have no drawbacks, but there needs to be some temptation, some reason for why the player would want to take those actions in the first place. But of course, as I said at the end, the other way to solve this problem is to simply not present either option as obviously morally better than the other. Either the player can be put in a situation where there are no good options being presented and it's up to them to decide what is considered a lesser evil, or you simply present the player with options that don't try to explicitly paint either as bad, such as by having different party members advocate for either choice, which is something that I think RPGs like Baldur's Gate 3 do a lot. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Do you have any other examples of games with really good or poorly designed moral choices? And what do you think about the various techniques that I have laid out so far? But as usual, if you liked the video, make sure to leave me a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. If you want to support the channel more directly, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.